What's poppin', pimps? Real quick before I get into anything on this, my friends know that I love to rant about things in regards to behavior, but I've never actually tried to script anything like this, so you'll have to forgive me if some parts of this are a bit off. This video is going to be my best attempt at substantiating some of my opinions on behavior and Dead by Daylight as a whole, and is meant to be criticism on some of their practices, both old and new. That being said, let's hope this doesn't take too long so that we can get back to the things that matter.
Are you seriously watching porn by yourself?
No! I'm with the science team!
Communication is key, and in behavior's eyes, it must be the broken key.
Ooh, you suck!
Bad puns aside, behavior has earned a reputation of not talking to anyone about anything ever. This comes in various forms such as the forums, the stream Q&As, almost streams, stats and their lack of, and other smaller things like the in-game report function, fun rating surveys, you know the like. Some of these, of course, you can give a bit of leeway to, but the fact is that it's taken nearly 5 years and they're only now asking the community's opinions on potential changes to one perk. And it just shows how close to their chest they keep information. Let's start with the most forgivable of these, the forums and stream Q&As. There are obviously some questions they simply can't and shouldn't answer, like the new killers, survivors, maps, etc. While in my opinion, it's perfectly acceptable to give teasers or hint at them, I feel the trailers do a good enough job in that regard, but the problem comes when you find a good forum post or hear a good question asked in one of the streams. I can't tell you how many times I've seen the little icon that says somebody like Almo, Not Queen, Peanuts, or others have responded just to find them answer an unrelated reply, or to simply not answer the OP's question at all. I don't quite know why, but it almost makes me feel cheated every time it happens, because they could simply pick a thread where they're actually able to discuss the topic at hand, instead of, getting our hopes up for proper responses to proper questions. Streams, on the other hand, are a strange case of non-issues that I don't quite know why they haven't figured out how to simply pick questions that they're willing to answer. It serves no purpose for the viewer to hear a good question, suggestion, or piece of feedback posed by somebody else in the community just for the devs to skip it. You guys are already vetting the questions, so why waste anybody's time with responses like we can't talk about that right now? It's just so weird to see behavior waste people's time on their streams when they're perfectly capable of just picking questions that they can actually answer. Next up on the communication sins are the stats provided by behavior themselves. I don't know how to put this in any other way, but they're useless. They're meaningless. They serve no purpose. The vast majority of the stats they provide, and they hate providing them because they do so infrequently, have a massive flaw or oversight in them that destroy any meaning you should be able to gather from them. These include things like testing a small portion of players for only 3 days, or including console players in statistics that would change the averages. That's nothing against console players, of course, but for things like Nurse's lethality, it's generally accepted amongst the community that the nurse on console is a very different killer than the nurse on PC. Now, to play devil's advocate, you can say that these stats not only have been updated, but that behavior has always maintained a don't take what stats we give you to mean anything approach. But that's not reasonable, when you could just provide worthwhile stats to begin with. Behavior was perfectly content releasing stats that showed a 20% increase in survival rates from ranks 2 to ranks 1, even though they only tested for 3 days. Behavior was also perfectly content releasing stats that showed the nurse to be amongst the least powerful killers in red ranks, without controlling for variables such as which platform the players played on. Why test for 3 days when you can test for 3 months? Why put your name on a chart claiming the nurse to be amongst the weakest killers in the game, when you know that you didn't control for factors that change that? Why justify nerfing Freddy based on the performance of the top 1% of Freddy killers versus the red ranks, when you should be comparing the top 1% of Freddy killers versus the top 1% of survivors? There are ways to gather and use stats in this game meaningful ways, it's just that behavior has time and time again shown a certain ineptitude in how they gather and use those stats. Last on my list of communication sins is of course Almo. Lots of people have already had this in mind when I mentioned communication, but in case you've forgotten or just had the pleasure of not knowing, here's a quick rundown of the recent events. Almo is one of the designers for the game, and he actually streams it amongst other things. During these streams, People ask questions in hopes of getting answers, and in a recent one, somebody asked about a colorblind setting, which people have been asking for since the game's release. Almost shut down this question and the person asking it pretty quickly, addressing it as boring, that they've heard it a million times, and that it'll get done if and when it gets done. This rightfully got a lot of people up in arms until BHVR announced on Twitter that they've been working on a colorblind setting in secret for some time. Now, my first problem with this is that they knowingly kept Almo in the dark about a massive quality of life change that people have been begging for years, and it really makes me wonder how much people know about the goings-on even amongst the staff. If one of their biggest talking heads doesn't know about this, what else doesn't he know about? What about other members of the team? Is all this secrecy even within the staff really necessary? I really don't see how. My second issue has to deal with the way that Almo belittled the person asking the question. How is it acceptable to essentially have your PR berate the people paying you money? I realize he was backed into a corner having to not answer a question he and others have had to not answer before for years, but you backed him into that corner yourselves, BHVR. You shouldn't have been keeping it a secret, not from your consumers, and especially not from your staff. Back in 2018, when I first got into the game, the monetization was actually a good selling point. I used to try to get my friends on board to play with me by saying things like, hey, look, it's not like the other games. These guys are actually pretty reasonable. You only need to pay for the killers owned by other companies like Freddy, Bubba, and Michael. And that's because they spend a dickload of money to even use these guys in the first place. Other than that, it's just a couple of shitty, brightly colored outfits, and that's all there is to the monetization. Everything else you can earn in-game just from playing. It was a breath of fresh air to see a company include brand new in-game mechanics just for a limited time event currency so that you can earn new outfits instead of being expected to pay for them. It was astonishing to me to see that you could even get perks locked away by paid characters through the Shrine of Secrets. It was great, but that was back in 2018. Nowadays it's a bit different, isn't it? Nowadays the developers tell us that they're concerned about the current grind, but opt to use daily rewards for events rather than the double blood points like in the events past. They'd rather you keep refreshing their Twitter page for codes to redeem for outfits rather than add new gameplay or even the gameplay from the events long ago, and they'd rather you spend money on their predatory battle pass system rather than play the game naturally. At the time of writing, popular perks like barbecue, Borrow Time, Corrupt Intervention, Discordance, Hex Undying, I'm All Ears, Infectious Fright, Surge, and Unbreakable have all appeared 5 times or less since the Shrine's been active. That means that these are all perks that have to be grinded for individually, which is more time, or, as it seems BHVR wants, more money. Because of course, you can always skip the ever-expanding grind of the game if you just pay them. The current track BHVR is on is becoming more and more reminiscent of big companies like EA, Activision, Ubisoft, more like AAA game studios, and not the sorts of actions you would expect extremely small groups to take. Granted, BHVR is much smaller than any of those companies, but they're certainly not as small as they make themselves out to be. And I think they want to keep it that way. We know the main faces of BHVR. These are the guys and girls that we see on the streams and the forums all the time. It's the same people. And I think that this illusion of a smaller dev team is by design. From my admittedly anecdotal surveying, most people seem to think BHVR employs anywhere from 50 to 150 people, which would be massive compared to the size of dev teams polled on IndieDB. After readjusting the data to remove those who aren't developers, you find that 59% work alone, 8% work in a team of just 2 to 4, 29% work in a team of 5 to 10, and only 3% are working in a team of more than 10 people. That puts BHVR at the very top. But the reality is that BHVR is just a little bit bigger than people seem to think they are. BHVR as a corporation is Canada's largest independent game developer, with over 750 employees. That's no small fry by any stretch of the imagination. It's my personal belief that BHVR presents itself as a smaller group than it really is to create a sense of endearment to their player base in hopes that their portrayal as a small group will allow them to excuse some of their actions. And it seems to be working. When the devs push out updates that aren't quite ready, people come in droves to defend BHVR from the big bad players that expected progress in a game that they actually spent money on. We're told to cut them some slack because they did their best, And if these recent updates are examples of behavior at their best, and not examples of them pumping out updates to try to push more and more people back into their game, and by extension, back into their shop, then we need new developers. That's not a riff at anyone in particular, but if the best parts of your recent updates are the bug compilations, then there's a problem, and something needs to be done. These last couple things are bits that I couldn't really fit anywhere else, or with each other, but I still wanted to address them. Firstly, I want to address how Behavior has used the PTB for a long time. Behavior has been using it to try out general ideas and new concepts or killers without taking the time to make sure things necessary to test the functionality of the killer or things that they're wanting to test functioned. If you want us to try new maps or killers, then make sure that the killer works and the map is not busted. I don't quite understand why Behavior will essentially say, don't look at this, this, and that, just try out this one thing for us, instead of having a nearly completed build, letting us test it, and then adjusting accordingly. The Blight's PTB had problems with detection of slams on both extremes of the spectrum. You slammed into things you weren't looking at most of the time, but also had zero collision with other objects such as hooks and chests. But Behavior wanted you to ignore that and just provide feedback on the general idea of the killer. That's a bit hard to do when your killer doesn't have working foundation. The Twins PTB had so many problems with Victor, but we were essentially told that they were aware of these problems and to just deal with it. The lack of effort put into these PTBs has massive transitions into the live build, because instead of tweaking working builds, they're always making massive changes a month or even a couple weeks before the live build is pushed through, and this creates a never-ending game of catch-up for bug fixes. The last thing I wanted to harp on is admittedly small, but to me it seems like a symptom of the problems plaguing Behavior. Behavior has stated that they want to, and will probably at some point, include sexuality into characters. Now, this doesn't automatically mean that they're going to make everybody gay, or everybody lesbian, or everybody's going to be trans, and I know that even just me mentioning having gay characters in the game as a problem will upset a lot of people, but hear me out. My problem is not with the sexuality, it's with the unimportance that it serves in this particular game. This is a game about an unending chase of cat and mouse between killers and survivors for the pleasure of the entity. There is zero necessity to pull an Overwatch and start throwing the unimportant sexualities of characters at the mob for woke points. There's no time in the lore of the game for somebody who's in the entity's realm to have a relationship. And sure, you can go back in the character's backstory and change things and give them a wife or give him a husband or something of the sort, but that's just more time that they're not making improvements to the game. Now, somebody could say, well, they're only changing a couple sentences here and there, so it shouldn't take that much time. To which I would say, sure, you can absolutely change the backstory page of some or even all of the characters, but it's more time that they're spending not making improvements to the game. Now, of course, there are absolutely ways and games to include the sexuality of your characters, but in a 1v4 asymmetrical horror game, it's just not important, and it's not something that they should be focusing any time on. That's all I've got for this. Please let me know what you think of it. Is there anything I've really missed? Are there things I've gotten wrong? Am I just dumb and don't know what I'm talking about? Please keep in mind I've never really tried to do anything like this before, so my scripting skills are probably subpar, but I've tried to be coherent and show why I believe the things I do. I also don't enjoy editing at all, so this will probably be a massive project for me, and I may or may not do something like this in the future. Who knows? What's poppin', pimps? Future Cool Tree Man here. Just went back after looking through all the audio and the script, and I failed to mention anywhere in that none of these points are supposed to be a very deep dive look into this, more like a cursory glance at them to show that they exist. If I were to do deep dives into any of these topics, most of them, if not all of them, could be easily a 30-minute, hour-long video on their own. And with my adverse opinions to editing, I don't want to do that. If you did like it, that's fucking awesome. If you didn't like it, that's fucking awesome. Feel free to enjoy the rest of this game, and let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks, man.